Welcome to the ALCTS webinar, Update on Archival Materials, Using RDA with DACS. What's new? I'm Maria Pincus, member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and will be your host for today's webinar. I'm delighted to present our speaker, Cory Nimer. Cory Nimer is a manuscripts cataloger and metadata specialist at Brigham Young University, where he is responsible for cataloging archival materials. He has served as co-chair of the Standards Committee for the Society of American Archivists. If you have questions for Cory, please type them at any time into the question box on your screen, and he will do his best to answer them at the conclusion of the presentation. If he does not have time to address all of the questions, they will be answered offline and sent to you in an email after the presentation. Also, please note the session will be recorded, and you will receive an email shortly after the conclusion of the webinar with a link to the recording. You will also receive a copy of the slides. If you're interested, the ALCTS CE Committee invites you to use the Twitter back channel on the screen to interact with other participants during this webinar. However, please continue to submit questions for the presenter in the box provided for questions. Neither the presenter nor the host will monitor Twitter. Now I will turn the presentation over to Cory. I'm seeing a black square on the slide. Let's hope this doesn't go on with the following slides. I apologize. Okay.
Maria, is that better?
Yes, that looks better.
All right. Good afternoon. As Maria said, my name is Cory Nimer, and I am a manuscripts cataloger and technical services archivist at Brigham Young University. I have, as Maria said, I have served as co-chair of the Society of American Archivists Standards Committee, and am currently the Society's representative to the MARC Advisory Committee and ALA's CCDA. Although today I'll be speaking not in these capacities, but from my own experience cataloging archival materials at BYU using RDA. SAA, for its part, has not yet published guidelines or best practices for the use of RDA, though it is hoped that such instructions will yet be made available. Instead, the second edition of DACS, which we will discuss briefly today, was developed as an independent standard, though with some concessions to changes implemented in RDA. Some guidelines have been developed, however, such as those in the PCC RDA BibCo Standard Record Metadata Application Profile, which we will use to help guide our discussion on creating hybrid records using RDA and DACS. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we will only be able to provide an overview of how to use these standards for describing archival aggregates or collections based on archival principles. In doing so, we will use RDA as our set of base rules, with DACS giving supplementary guidance and interpretation. And hopefully over the course of the presentation, it will be clear why this approach was taken. For those who might not be familiar with DACS, Describing Archives Content Standard is a national content standard for archival descriptions as well as authority records. DACS was developed as an implementation of two international standards, General International Standard Archival Description, or ISAD-G, and International Standard Archival Authority Records for Corporate Bodies, Persons, and Families, or ISAR-CPF. DACS was first released by the Society of American Archivists in 2004, with a second edition released last year. It is meant to be an output-neutral standard, allowing it to be used with MARC as well as encoded archival description and other archival encoding standards, and has been widely adopted within the American archival community. It may be for this reason that during the development of RDA, the Library of Congress proposed integrating DACS's rules directly into that standard. Some modifications were made there to make them acceptable to an international audience. The revision process also removed much of the discussion about archival principles. So in the end, what ended up in RDA from DACS is a more generic model that is missing the context for explaining how those rules might be applied. In this way, DACS can provide important guidance on understanding not only how to formulate archival descriptions, but why archival approaches might be useful. On the other hand, in the course of the revision process that resulted in the second edition of DACS, the archival community has attempted to accommodate RDA with the integration of various provisions of that standard that were transferred into the archival standard. This includes smaller issues, such as the adoption of RDA terminology, such as devised titles instead of supplied titles, as well as major changes such as the removal of DACS Part 3, a step which will likely result in a greater reliance on RDA for formulating authorized access points. So today I'd like to focus on how RDA and DACS can be used together to create hybrid records, an approach aimed at maximizing the compatibility of these records across library and archival systems while retaining a focus on archival methods and principles. As stated in the definition given in the RDA glossary on the screen here, archives are created and managed differently than library materials. The definition points out that these guidelines could be used for aggregations of materials or single items, for organic accumulations or artificial collections. By using archival descriptive practices, using rules from either RDA or DACS, the primary focus is on documenting provenance and the relationships between materials and their creators. So today, because of our limited time, I'd like to focus on elements in the RDA core and DACS required lists. As you know, RDA includes a set of core level elements, and for archival materials, those included are listed here. However, DACS also includes a set of what are termed in the second edition of DACS as required elements. Some of these duplicate those listed in the RDA core, but I've listed out the additional requirements at the bottom of this list on the slide. I'll be going through each of those briefly, looking first at the guidelines given in RDA, and then how the DACS rules might be used to supplement RDA, either by providing more specific guidance about how that element ought to be used, or by giving additional options for recording that information. Before looking at the individual elements, it might be worth stating that when describing archival materials, you'll be able to take your information from a broader range of sources than from more traditional cataloging. Archival aggregates are generally not self-identifying in the same way as printed materials with title pages, dust jackets, and colophons. Instead, most of the descriptive elements are supplied by the cataloger based on a review of the materials themselves, or from inventories or other transfer documentation. As given in the general provisions on sources in RDA 2.2.2, if information required for the identification of a resource is not available from a source forming part of the resource itself, take it from another source as instructed in 2.2.4. Information then can be taken from a variety of sources and, as stated in the exception at the end of 2.2.4, be recorded without the use of brackets. This is in accordance with archival practice and the guidelines given in the introduction to DACS. So the first core element in RDA for an archival aggregate would be the title proper. Although the general guidelines for titles in 2.3.1.4 is to, quote, transcribe a title as it appears on the source of information, again, due to the general lack of a designated source, the title will need to be devised by the cataloger. The rules allow these titles to be formulated in a variety of ways and can include either a term describing the nature of the resource, a term related to the subject of the resource, or a combination of the two. For archival materials, RDA 2.3.2.11.4 calls for catalogers to record the name of the creator or the collector of the materials where appropriate, as well as part of the title. The RDA rules also call for the devised title to be in the language of the materials themselves, although there is an ALCTS approved option to use the language of the cataloging agency instead. So let's look at how this would work with a collection of photographs of Mount Timpanogos here in Utah Valley, created by BYU professor Eugene Roberts. Using the general devised title rules, you could follow the various options of recording just the nature of the resource, as in photographs, The subject of the resource could also be recorded as a title, in the case of Mount Timpanogos. And the subject and the combination of the two results in photographs of Mount Timpanogos. However, again following the archival provisions, the device title should also include the creator, allowing the possibility of a title such as Eugene Roberts' Photographs of Mount Timpanogos, as at the bottom. However, RDA does not provide specific guidance on how the different potential elements of a device title should be combined in a consistent manner. This type of regularity can be improved by using DACS together with RDA, as DACS provides more specific requirements for constructing titles for archival aggregates. According to DACS 2.3, the required elements of a device title include a name segment listing the creator or collector of materials and the nature of materials segment. The topical segment of the title can also be included, as we saw in RDA, although according to DACS this is an optional element. DACS also provides more specific guidance on how to record the creator, such as the form of the name to be used and the number of creators that might be included in the title. It also includes guidelines for the number of different types of material that should be listed in the nature of material segment and for how topical segments should be formulated. Looking back at the previous example then, by applying the provisions from DACS 2.3 we get a slightly different result. A title with only the DACS required title segment of creator and type of materials, or a longer string with the name, type of materials, and subject. We can also see that those earlier RDA options with just the type of material or just the subject of the material are no longer allowed when using RDA in conjunction with DACS. The last example given with the type of material and the subject might be possible if you didn't know who the creator was according to DACS. But generally according to DACS guidelines, as in RDA, a device title for archival material should include the creator of the materials as part of that string. The next core element is the date of production. RDA includes production dates in 2.7 as part of the production statement. However, of the three elements that make up the production statement, only the date of production is required. The other two elements are optional, and while they might be useful for an individual manuscript, would probably not be recorded for archival materials. The specific rules for recording production dates are provided in RDA 2.7.6.7 and include specific guidance on how to record a single date, how to record a span of dates, how to record bulk dates, and what to record in the case where dates aren't provided and have to be estimated. RDA prefers that approximate dates be provided, though the phrase date of production not identified is allowed in cases where estimated dates might be misleading. So again, looking at some examples of how that works, we can see that for a single date it asks for either the year or a more specific date within the year, although it doesn't provide guidance on how that should be specifically formulated. Inclusive dates are just a closed range from the earliest date to the latest date of material. Bulk dates are added following a comma, and qualifiers indicating estimated or questionable dates are appended to the text string. Another change made in RDA was the adjustment of mark mappings for dates. Traditionally, for archival materials, the date was recorded as part of the 245 field in subfield F, as given in the first example on the slide. But that practice has now been deprecated and moved in RDA to a separate field from the title, again recorded now in the mark 264, second indicator 0, subfield C. Turning now to DACS, section 2.4 of those rules again provides additional guidance on how for catalogers on how dates should be applied for archival aggregates. This includes a broadening of the definition of dates to include not just the date of the creation of materials, but record-keeping, publication, and broadcast dates. DACS also provides more specific information on how to record dates, specifying the format for single years or a single date entry, providing specific guidance for materials that have ongoing accruals, and for recording dates for materials that might have a gap where recording an inclusive date span might be somewhat deceiving for a researcher. Again, looking at how this plays out in our examples, we can see that using DACS with RDA can provide greater consistency in application. For example, DACS provides more specific guidance on single dates, recommending a year, month, day format. It also includes requirements to have a closed date span for a description, not leaving an open span as might be seen in serial records, as well as calling for the use of multiple date spans to describe materials that might have a gap in their content. Of course, these rules focus on the text strings available in the record and not on machine-readable information, as might be seen here on the slide in the 008 or 046 fields. The next core element in RDA is content type, an expression-level element not paralleled in DACS. The guidelines for this element are given in RDA 6.9, and include a list of terms such as text or still image. The guidelines call for catalogers to record as many terms as are applicable to the material. However, it does not provide the option of listing terms, however, it does provide the option of listing terms for only the predominant content type, or for the most substantial portions. When dealing with archival aggregates that include diverse content, it may be best to take the alternative rather than providing an exhaustive list of content types, although that is an option that's available. The next core element is carrier type, which is also an RDA-specific element. As with content type, the rules in RDA 3.3 provide a set list of terms that can be recorded and instructs catalogers to record as many terms as are applicable, with the option of recording only the predominant or most substantial types. Again, with archival aggregates, that includes a variety of material types. It may be better to take the alternative than providing an exhaustive list. The next element in the RDA core is extent. RDA provides three options in 3.4.1.11.1, including recording extent by the number of items or containers, recording the amount of storage space required, or recording the number and type of units in the collection. Again, let's look at some examples of how this might look. With the number of units method, these are recorded directly with the option of having parallel statements. In the case of storage space, we see that these have been recorded in terms of linear feet according to the LC policy statements based on the option available in RDA. And finally, in the type of unit section, the carrier type terms are combined with an item number to express extent. Turning now to DACS, in the case of extent, we find that instead of introducing greater consistency, the archival rules provide some greater flexibility in recording this statement. While using the same three basic categories for recording extent, DACS 2.5.7 expands the provisions for including parallel statements of extent to all categories. Also, with the second edition of DACS, the RDA categories are extended to 2 electronic records for recording by storage space or number and type of unit. So looking back at the examples, we can see the added options for including extent statements, including parallel extent statements in all categories, as well as a couple of examples of recording the extent of electronic records, either by storage space or by number and type of items. For better or for worse, in this particular area, archivists have allowed a wide variety of practice, and it is up to individual institutions to determine which options to use. The final core element required by RDA is recording creator relationships between the body of the material being described and its creator. RDA includes a fairly broad definition of what a creator is, a person, family, or corporate body responsible for the creation of a work, and includes compilations as well as authorial roles. RDA also provides specific rules for determining when corporate bodies should be recorded as creators. These categories are basically unchanged from AACR2 and are described in RDA 19.2.1.1.1. While primarily aimed at published works, some of the categories might be applicable for archival aggregates, including Category A works that are of an administrative nature dealing with internal policies and procedures, or Category C works that record collective activity of a conference or exhibition or an event. The rules allow all creators to be recorded. However, only the most predominant or the first named creator is core. The nature of the relationship between the creator and the materials is then recorded using a relationship designator. According to RDA 18.5.3.1, these terms are to be taken from Appendix I, although the PCC guidelines allow the use of terms from the MARC relators list as well. Looking again at how this information might be recorded, although RDA provides the option of using an identifier, in the bibliographic record, the 1XX field is where the creator of the material is associated through the insertion of the creator's authorized access point. So the Rose M. Hinton Papers has a 100 field entry for Rose M. Hinton, and in the Department of History record, the 110 links to the Department of History. Looking now at DACS, the archival standard provides a somewhat broader definition of what constitutes a creator, not limiting it to actual creation, but also including assembly, accumulation, maintenance, and use of the materials as creator relationships. In the second edition of DACS, the general rule in 2.6.4 is that creators that are named in the devised title will also be linked as creators. These are then optionally connected using relationship designators, with DACS referring out to Appendix I of RDA and the MARC relators list for the terms available. However, the catch-all options from the first edition of DACS have been removed in order to push linking of creators to the appropriate level of multi-level description. Returning to the examples, then we have basically the same result with the addition of the general creator relationship identifier designator that is taken from the MARC relators list. And so this brings us to the end of the RDA core elements. However, in creating an RDA DACS hybrid record, it is important to also include the required elements from DACS, which are in addition to core, again going back to that earlier list. The first of these is the item identifier, which is somewhat different from the manifestation identifier that is on the RDA's core list. Looking to the manifestation rules provided in RDA 2.15, the focus there is on standard numbers such as ISBNs or ISSNs that would be used to connect multiple items of the single manifestation. Archival aggregations, which often exist as manifestation singletons, typically have item identifiers instead. The rules for recording these item identifiers are given in RDA 2.19. Looking at the rules in that section, it basically requires that the name of the repository be recorded as well as the local identifier. The DACS rules given in DACS 2.1 are similar and require both a local identifier and a repository identifier. However, it does not require that these be recorded in a single field as in RDA. So looking at the examples, the differences are fairly clear, with the RDA call number providing the repository reference in the identifier string, and DACS separating these out into separate fields. While there is some recognition within the archival community of the value of unambiguous identifiers, this remains an area with the need for best practices that could be used across cultural heritage institutions. The next DACS required element is the name and location of the repository. This is included in RDA in section 4.3 under contact information. Under those guidelines, this entry should include the name of the repository, including parent bodies, mailing address, and other contact information. These are basically the same rules that you would find in DACS 2.2. RDA currently does not provide an accurate mapping for this element in its archival usage, though DACS Appendix C maps this to the 852 or the 524 fields for recording this information depending on whether you wanted that as the name and location repository as part of the preferred citation. The next DACS required element is scope and content. In RDA, this is essentially covered in 3 elements. RDA 7.2 includes the nature of the content, 7.3 the coverage of the content, and 7.10 the summarization of the content. Looking at some of the examples given in the text, it would appear that 7.10, summarization of the content, is closest to what an archival scope and content note would typically include. However, the guidelines for that element as shown on the slide are focused primarily on the content of the material. The scope and content node as described in DACS 3.1, on the other hand, includes not just the content, but a broader description of the materials that includes documentary forms present in the collection, dates, geographic areas, as well as the functions and activities that generated those materials in the first place. Looking at an example of how this might appear, here's an example that's actually included in RDA 7.10, but you can see that it includes some of the broader categories of information taken from DACS as part of that note. And so again, this is another case where using DACS in association with RDA can provide more information on how these descriptions ought to be put together, as well as extended examples. Another element required in DACS is 4.1, the conditions governing access element. As with the previous elements, this is also included in RDA in 4.4.1. In the RDA guidelines, catalogers are instructed to include the nature of the restriction and its duration, as well as the option of recording when there is no restriction on those materials. DACS expands on these guidelines, however, including instructions for recording the authority that imposed the restriction, contact information, and other details. It also expands the requirement on recording the lack of restrictions, making it mandatory. The last element in the DACS required element set is the language and scripts of the material. This is included in RDA 6.11, which calls for recording the language in which the work is expressed with the language terms taken from a controlled list. These guidelines are tied to the MARC code list for languages and the ELSI policy statements. These instructions are then largely mirrored in DACS 4.5, although the archival rules also stipulate that scripts used should also be recorded as part of the description. Having run through the individual elements of the bibliographic record, bringing it all together now into a single hybrid record that complies with both the RDA core and DACS required element set, we can see we have a basic record that would be similar to the example on this slide. Looking at the fields, this includes the title, data production, extent, content and carrier types, the scope and content note, restrictions on access, the name and location of the repository, an identifier, and the language of the material. All right. So we'll turn now from describing archival aggregates to describing their creators. According to DACS Principle 8, the documentation of creators is just as important as record description in order to provide adequate context for the materials themselves. With the release of RDA, the possibilities to record this type of information in authority records was greatly expanded, and there are now a wide range of data elements available for describing creators. DACS, for its part, includes with its second edition a range of descriptive data elements as well, though the list does not entirely overlap with RDA. However, as mentioned earlier, the changes in DACS also include the removal of the rules for formulating authorized access points, leaving archivists to rely on RDA or other rules for the formulation of headings. In the end, as with the bibliographic record, the standards, while similar in places, have a slightly different perspective that can potentially inform their mutual application. So looking at the core element list for authority records in RDA, we will see that it includes a broad list of elements that are to be used when applicable or readily ascertainable, as well as a list of core if statement or elements. These can be recorded as part of the access point or in separate elements, though the list focuses on elements traditionally included in the access point. It also requires recording an identifier and in addition through the LC policy statement source citations. The minimal list in DACS Chapter 9 does not ask for much more. The one specific difference from RDA being that it does not require dates. That it does require dates to be recorded as a separate element, whether they're part of the access point or not. So looking briefly at the core elements for each entity type in RDA, we can see that the list is fairly limited. The overlapping elements between RDA and DACS requirements are few as well, and are indicated here in bold text. For persons, this includes only the preferred name as part of the access point, the date of birth and death, and the identifier. For corporate bodies, there's a more extensive list of core elements, though again very similar overlapping DACS and RDA requirements. And finally, with families, a much shorter list, but again the same basic overlapping categories of preferred name, associated dates, and identifier. Another element worth mentioning in terms of a minimal level DACS requirement, though it's not on the list, is linking related entities. This is mentioned specifically in DACS Principle 8 as a minimal requirement and calls for the ability to link successive bodies to one another and perhaps hierarchically. This was also an area of expansion in RDA and is included in Section 9 of that standard. The full range of potential relationships is given in RDA Appendix K, a list which we expect will dramatically expand over the next year or so. To meet the minimal requirements, however, we'll only review examples of predecessor-successor relationships and hierarchical relationships. Looking at these three examples, the relationships are recorded in MARC authority records in the 5XX fields, with the relationship designator clearly entered and the other entity linked through its authorized access point. In this example, linking these two records in a predecessor-successor relationship. The same mechanism is used for recording hierarchical relationships. This is particularly useful in cases where the structure of the authorized access point doesn't clearly indicate that such a relationship exists. In the example given, recording this relationship makes clear within the record how the Harold B. Lee Library relates to Brigham Young University as superior and subordinate bodies. So again, looking at how these different elements come together, the RDA core and DACS minimal requirements forming a brief authority record, it should be noted that unlike bibliographic records, authority records are currently not allowed to be recorded or be coded as hybrids, so only RDA appears in the 040. It should also be said that there is far more that can be done with these records, although the core and minimal element set is what is shown in this example. So, having looked at the basic elements of archival description and RDA and DACS, it is hoped that it has illustrated the compatibility of the two standards, as well as the potential benefits from using them in conjunction with one another. Integrating RDA into their descriptive practice will allow archivists to improve the compatibility and findability of their records in mixed databases, while the new MARC fields based on the standard will expand their ability to record contextual information in authority records. For librarians who are looking at RDA as their core descriptive standard, I believe that the possibilities of using DACS as a companion standard that provides both greater standardization and flexibility, along with a greater number of examples, are clear as well. Over the past few years, much has changed for both archival and library standards, in each case based in part on the desire to improve cross-community sharing. As standards continue to develop in the future, I hope this trend will continue. Thank you. So I believe we have time for a few questions now. Actually, it looks like plenty of time for questions. Maria, should I just go through the list then?
Yes, I can monitor some of the questions now, and there's some comments. But if you have more questions, please write them into your question box. Our first question is, how do you add content, media, and carrier types when the archival collection contains mixed materials and no one type predominates, such as oral and video interviews, text transcripts, photos, and papers in one collection?
So, as I mentioned earlier, in this particular case, content types are, well, content, media, and carrier types are RDA-specific elements of the description. And according to those rules, you basically have three options, either recording all of those types that are present, doing the predominant forms, or doing the most significant forms. Here at BYU, we've decided to follow the option and record predominant forms, although I know the question is if no one type predominates. And so in that case, we typically have followed the most significant portion. Significance comes down to a value judgment, though, so it's a little less reliable than going with the RDA core rule, which would be to record every content type. And I know National Library of Agriculture has already put out a policy statement saying they'll record all of those, although other communities so far have not come out with a statement one way or the other.
Excuse me, I have a note here that there's no sound. Is anybody else experiencing this? Well, I guess that if I'm speaking, you're not going to hear me. If there's no sound. Sound is just fine. I have sound. All right. Okay, so it was just one person, it seems. All right, so then we can go on to the next question.
Okay.
What's the value of putting content and carrier types in the new 3XX fields when the same terms likely also appear elsewhere in records, including 655?
That is a very good question. I'm not entirely sure what was viewed as the difference between the 3XX fields versus the 655 field, for example, in terms of encoding practice. It would be my suspicion that it's just that a lot of institutions aren't using 655 for their records, especially if it's books or published items versus archival or rare material items. So I'm not entirely sure why they're broken out into 3xx versus 655, but so beyond that, I think there is benefit regardless in using those content and carrier types, those 3xx fields, just so in a mixed environment they're findable alongside those. I mean, if you have a discovery tool that's going to be doing faceting, that they'll have the same terms to be able to facet the same way and not get knocked out of the search because they're missing those fields. I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, Jackie, but
she has somebody, I guess this is not Jackie, it's Jean. She has a follow-up question to that. It says, so should we be using both 300 and 655? Would that be the best practice?
I know it's what we do here. Again, there aren't specifically best practices on doing this that are widely accepted. But if you're creating a hybrid RDA DACS record, those carrier and content types, not necessarily the media type, but content and carrier are core elements and should be recorded as part of that record.
Now, Jackie is following up on her question, the 3xx's versus 655s. She says the specific RDA vocabularies are so non-specific, especially those that make sense for archival materials. And then she puts in an example, sheet.
That is very true. I mean, you can definitely, if you have things that are in volumes, you can record volume. If you have something that's on sheets, you can record sheets. Whether that does very much for a user, I don't know. But again, I think the benefit of using them is just that if somebody does a search and limits for whatever reason on sheet, if those fields aren't available in the archival records, they're probably going to be knocked out of those search results. And so, again, this is just my opinion, but if you're working in an environment where most of the records are going to have those content and carrier types, I think there's a benefit to having those in there for archival material, whether it makes sense or not. And I guess that last comment, Jackie, that you put in, if they're not indexing them, then I guess that, I mean, that's up to you at an institutional level, although if you're putting those records into OCLC, I don't know if OCLC is using them or plans to use them eventually, but again, for me, it's mostly about consistency.
Here's a question that also has to do with 300 fields. It says, in your coding example, you didn't have a 337 field. Do we not record a 337 for archival materials? In going through the presentation was only doing core elements. 337 is not an RDA core element, although I think PCC has it as a core element. So there's no problem with recording a 337 if you're doing a 336 and a 338 already. Especially if you're using macros, that's an easy thing to add in. It just wasn't included in the example because it's not core. Another question. So when recording dates for single item manuscripts, the date no longer appears as part of the title in the 245F. How do you differentiate from other single items that may have a similar title, such as letters written on different dates?
That is something that we've struggled with here, and so far we've just determined to go ahead and let them duplicate as far as the title itself. In some ways, this is, in RDA's terms, it's probably not necessarily a problem because if you had things with the same title, you'd have this expectation of creating a uniform title for it and having to differentiate in the heading as part of that. We have gone back and forth here about going ahead and leaving dates in the title, but not coding them separate, coding that portion of the title separately, just having that as, in some ways, a topical subdivision of the DACS title. If we did that, though, we would still be recording the date as a date in the 246. Or 264, sorry.
I have a comment here, sort of giving some information about the 3xx's, saying, yes, OCLC is adding the new 3xx's to records that lack them as part of RDAification.
Okay.
Most of everything else we have is yes, it's like statements. One says that DACS 2.5.4 spells out FT as feet.
That is true. There were some efforts to try to align the two standards, but RDA continues to say that feet should be abbreviated as FT, and so again, looking at the presentation and the way the examples were put together, it was assuming RDA as the base set of rules. And so in that case, the examples were abbreviating feet as FT period. But DACS, for its own sake, I don't think cares one way or the other. There is a general sense in DACS to avoid abbreviations. And so you could make an argument for spelling it out. But if you're using RDA in conjunction with it, you may want to abbreviate just for consistency.
I have another question here. Have researchers noticed the difference in records? If yes, do they find RDA records more useful?
We did do some user testing of RDA records as part of the RDA test in 2010, 2011. Generally, they found sort of minimal or I don't know. They didn't see a major difference between AACR2 records and RDA records, or DACS records, straight DACS records versus hybrid records. And I don't know if it was a big enough difference to say one way or the other whether they liked them better or not. They did recognize that there were differences, and they were in favor of reduction of abbreviations and other sort of general RDA provisions, but whether they liked the 3xx fields or not, I don't actually remember them saying one way or the other whether they found them useful.
Okay. Another follow-up from Jackie. The last one, do you see it, Cory?
Whether the 245 F and G subfields are still valid. As far as I know, they have not changed the mark standard to deprecate those subfields. Although, again, the mapping now seems to recommend not recording that information in those fields, but recording it in the 264. The 264 doesn't have that differentiation between inclusive and bulk dates like you had in the F and G subfields. But again, it's really just intended to be a a text string, and you could use, you could record that information in a machine-readable way between the 008 and the 046.
And this is a comment. It says, in an OCLC record, only recording Department of History records as the title without the creating agency as part of the 245 makes it hard when looking at the title list to know to which university these records belong.
That is very true. And I know I've gone through and done that in OCLC various times. I've ended up searching by creator or by the heading rather than searching by title in those cases, because you're right. Almost everyone has a Department of History, and throwing this all together into one environment makes that hard to use, at least in Connection Client. Maybe in WorldCat it'd be easier to see a list of who the creators were and facet it out that way.
Okay, so if there's any other question, please type them into the box. We still have some time. You did not mention place of production. Is that not a core RDA element?
The only element in that production set that is core is the date. Again, if you've looked at Robert Maxwell's handbook for RDA, at the end it does have an appendix on doing archival and manuscript materials. If you go through that, he does, I mean, you'll see that he does list those elements: place of production, name of producer, as potential elements, although it's more in the context of single manuscripts rather than archival materials. For archival materials, it's just that, as far as I know, the date that's the core element.
The 33X field is very popular. Here we have something from Kit. Do you know of any institution that uses local or controlled vocabularies in the 33X fields or the content type and carrier?
I have not heard of any institution using local lists. The rules themselves point specifically to those vocabularies that are included in RDA. I mean, of course, people for the 655 field oftentimes will use local headings, and we use some of those here. But as far as I know, I'm not aware of anyone using local terms for that 33X field.
Are there formal SAA workshops on RDA DACS Smart Records?
As far as I know, there currently aren't. We recently had the revised DACS workshop come here, and the focus of that was definitely not MARC-centric. So I think it would be something useful. Again, today we've only been able to do just a quick overview of just the core elements, and there's a lot more that RDA, I think, offers to archivists, whether that's in describing the materials themselves, but I mean, more especially, there's a huge range of fields available for recording information about creators and authority records that we just weren't looking at today. So it would be good to have that workshop. I don't know if there'd be enough interest for that to be done regularly, though.
Do we know when SAA will publish RDA guidelines?
Well, they currently have me working on putting together an implementation guide for RDA, sort of general guidelines for implementing implementing DACS, in which I was planning on including some RDA provisions. From what I've seen, it's currently scheduled to be published next summer, so summer 2015. I don't know if they'll put out any additional guidelines between now and then, though.
Can you recommend a good resource for looking at RDA examples of archival collections, apart from the RDA rules?
The only thing that comes to mind that has any example is Maxwell's Handbook to RDA. If you're just looking for examples, sort of unfiltered examples, the easiest way is probably just to start searching for hybrid records that have RDA and DACS in OCLC's connection. That should bring back archival records that are, again, using this approach.
Okay, so we've gotten to the end of our questions. We're getting to the end of our time too. So I guess we can move on to our conclusion.
Okay.
So thank you for your presentation, Cory. This has been a great update about using RDA with describing archives, a content standard, DACS. Thank you also for all of you attendees today. We hope you found today's session useful. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us. The comments that are received are reviewed by the ALCTS CE Committee and used to plan additional continuing education offerings. Information about all ALCTS webinars are featured on the ALCTS website at the link provided on this slide. We have one more webinar, MOOCs, scheduled for the spring, as you can see on the screen. Stay tuned for all our fall offerings. If you have a webinar topic in mind, you can suggest it using the online webinar proposal form on the webinar webpage on the ALCTS Continuing site. ALCTS will be offering 2 virtual pre-conferences before ALA Annual. These are composed of 3 live 1-hour sessions. Recordings will be available. We also offer free e-forums on a regular basis and multiple sessions of our Fundamentals of course series, Fundamentals of Acquisitions, of Preservation, etc. Check the website for exact dates, as they are offered multiple times throughout the year. Before we sign off, I would like to thank Aiping Chen Gaffey and Aaron Boyd for providing technical support for today's webinar. Thanks also go to Julie Reese and Vicky Grudzinski of the ALCTS office for taking care of all of the logistics that help the webinar process run smoothly. And thank you again for joining us today. We hope you will participate in other ALCTS continuing education offerings again in the future.